So what I want to do today is to briefly talk about a project I have been working on for several years now, and I hope to finish this year or next year. And it's called Aramaic Manuals of Divination from the Cairo Genizah. What I want to do today is to give you a survey and some specific examples. And let me start by saying what I'm going to do. I'm going to very briefly talk about the aim and scope of the corpus, what I include, what I exclude, and why. I'm going to very briefly give you a bird's eye view of the entire corpus. I have 19 texts, I'll show you, or briefly survey them. I'm going to talk about manuscript context, that is, how these texts, in which manuscripts do they travel, and with which other manuscripts do they travel. I'm going to talk a little bit about parallels to these texts in the Jewish world and outside the Jewish world. And I'm going to very briefly summarize and talk about the wider significance of all these texts. Let me begin by explaining what I want to include in this corpus of, as I said, Aramaic Manuals of Divination from the Cairo Genizah. First of all, let me explain for those, if there's anyone who doesn't know, the Cairo Genizah is like an archive of a medieval synagogue from Cairo, which was active. The synagogue was active from the 11th to the 19th century. And basically they threw all their used papers and parchments into this Genizah. It was found 120 years ago, and it still hasn't been surveyed in a systematic way. Some scholars have surveyed the whole Genizah in search of some things. Other scholars have searched in search of other things. I am mainly working on the magical and the divinatory text from the Cairo Genizah. There are about 300,000 fragments from the Genizah in various libraries all over the world. And I've now basically seen every Genizah fragment in the world. And the corpus I'm talking about today is one of the corpora I'm building from this material. And this is a corpus of manuals of divination only in Aramaic. And the reason why I include only Aramaic is because Aramaic is a much older language. That is, the texts I'm working with, the texts in my corpus the manuscripts are from the 11th century mostly. But the texts I'm claiming are much, much older than that. They go back to late antiquity, to the pre-Islamic world, because after the conquest, after the Islamic conquest, Jews gradually moved from Aramaic as their main language to Arabic as their main language. So texts which are preserved in the Genizah in Aramaic are probably much, much older than the 10th or 11th or 12th century. And that's why I'm interested in Aramaic texts. And what most of these texts have in common is the structure which is very common to manuals of divination. If an omen X occurs, so if there's a solar eclipse on the month X, there will be hunger here and famine there and things like that. If there's a lunar eclipse, if you dreamt about this thing, so and so will happen, etc. What I exclude are some other types of Aramaic divination texts, especially those that involve magical rituals. I won't go into that. I ignore Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic manuals of divination unless I can show that they are translations of older Aramaic texts. And I also I don't include in my corpus manuals of divination that are tested only outside the Cairo Genizah. And here I will skip 2 minor points so as to not take too much time. And what I want to do is to give you a brief survey of what this corpus includes. So I have, as I said, 19 texts, and I divide them according to types. So first of all, the most common type is astrological text. This is non-mathematical astrology. So this is not the astrology that you get in the Jewish Middle Ages with Avraham ibn Ezra and Barchia and people like that. This is what we might call popular astrology. My friend Raimund Leicht called it Kleinliteratur, astrologische Kleinliteratur, so small texts of astrology. And one text, for example, is Masoret Ezra. Masoret Ezra is a calendologion. That is, it foretells the weather condition in the 4 seasons of the year, the general agriculture and medical conditions for the entire year, and according to the calendar Januaris, the 1st of January in the Roman calendar. Very interesting. It's not the Jewish calendar, it's the Roman calendar. So if the 1st of January falls on Sunday, the next year will be so-and-so. If the 1st of January falls on Monday, the year will be so-and-so. If the 1st of January falls on Tuesday, etc. This is a text that is very well known, very widely known. It's known in Latin, it's known in Greek, it's known in many vernacular languages, Anglo-Saxon and things like that. And now we also have a fragment of it in Aramaic. Afterwards, I'll even show you the manuscript. A second text, which also is very, very well known, is the treatise of Shem, which is sometimes called Kitab Kansar, the book of Kansar. And this is a different type of kalendologion. And this says that if the year begins in the sign in Aries, in Gemini, in Scorpio, etc., then the year will be so-and-so. It's not entirely clear what it means that the year will begin in sign so-and-so. I leave that apart. This is a text that is also attested in Syriac, and people have thought that there would be an Aramaic version, and one fragment of the Aramaic text was published already, and I found more fragments of the Aramaic text. So this is another text. A third text has to do with prognostications of wheat prices from what we call in Hebrew Tkufat Tevet. Sorry about that. From Tkufat Tevet, that is, this is a very short text, and it says, if Tkufat Tevet, if the winter solstice falls on these days of the Hebrew month Tevet, then the wheat will be expensive. And if it falls on these days, the wheat will be cheaper. And if it falls on these days, the wheat will be cheaper. So you can foretell the price of wheat from when Tkufat Tevet falls. Another text is actually two texts, two hemerologia, two different hemerologia. That is texts that tell you about each day of the lunar month, of the 30 days of the lunar month, which mythological figure was born in it. So on this day, so-and-so was born, on this day, so-and-so was born, and then what activities you should or you should not do on each day. The first of the month is good for sowing seeds, but is not good for buying cattle. It's good for buying slaves, but it's not good for sailing in the sea, etc., etc. And then it goes on. The first of these texts was already published by Shaul Shaked. The second text, what I call Hemerologion B, is still unpublished, and I will publish it. Another text that I have is a horologion, that is not a hemerologion per day, but horologion per hour. That is, I don't know if you know this system, but just as the days of the week are divided between the 7 planets, Sunday is the day of the sun, Monday is the day of the moon. In French, mardi is the day of Mars, etc. Mercredi is the day of Mercury. So there's a similar system for each hour of the week. Each hour of the week belongs to one of the planets. And this text explains how it works, which planet rules each hour of the week, and what each hour of the week is good or not good for. So, on Sunday, on the 3rd hour, you shouldn't marry a woman. On Sunday, on the 4th hour, you should go on travel. On Sunday, in the 5th hour, you shouldn't do this and that. You should do that and that. And this is a paper that I published a few years ago, and it will also be included in my corpus. And there's another text, which is of the same type, but a different text, clearly not the same text. And it's also written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic rather than in Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. So apparently some of these texts you get even in the Jewish world, more than one copy or more than one example of these texts. Sometimes the Jews of Babylonia have one text, the Jews of Palestine have another text. So this is why you get these different versions of the same basic idea of a horologion. Another text, there are several texts with eclipses. You know that eclipses of the moon and eclipses of the sun have always been seen as omens. So one text is lunar eclipses per month, and that foretells what will happen in different lands, including wars, rebellions, agricultural conditions, the rise of the Nile. So you hear echoes of a possible Egyptian origin or context. And the protasis is if there's a lunar eclipse in each month of the Jewish year. So if there's a lunar eclipse in Nisan, in Iyar, in Sivan, in Tammuz, etc., etc. This is a text that I published with Mar Geller, and I also discussed in a Hebrew paper by which I published a few years ago. But I've meanwhile found more copies of it, so there's more textual material now than I had then. There are two similar texts of solar eclipses. So one solar eclipse per month, if there's a solar eclipse in Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, etc. And one solar eclipses per hour. If there's a solar eclipse in the first hour of the day, so-and-so will happen. If it's on the second hour of the day, so-and-so will happen, etc., etc. There is a manual which is based on the shape of the crescent moon. You know, when there's a new moon and it has this crescent, very thin crescent shape, whether the horns are symmetrical or they're tilted in one way or tilted in another way, and that will tell you what will happen next year in the world. And again, this is a paper, a text that I published with Mar Geller in the paper I mentioned before, and I also discussed it in Hebrew. And again, I have more textual copies now of this text. There's another text of which I have only a small fragment with astrological geography. That is, it explains, you know, this idea of which region of the earth is governed by which of the zodiac signs. So, you know, Taurus governs, I don't know, Libya and Ethiopia and other countries, and Libra governs, I don't know, Palestine and I don't know, maybe Russia and whatever, things like that. I have only two of the zodiac signs preserved for this text, but it clearly covered all 12 signs. Another text, or there are several texts with meteorological predictions. So one of them, very, very interesting, tells you to go out on the 4 days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, so on the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th of Tishrei, and you observe the weather conditions on these days, if it's raining, if there's frost, if there's a heat wave, if there's a lot of dew, and from that you will know, you are supposed to know, it's supposed to foretell the weather conditions in the entire year. This is a very interesting text and also very Jewish. I mean, this idea that these are the days right before Sukkot when God decides about the weather for the next year. There's another text of which I have a small fragment with prognostications from rain and hail in each month. So if there's rain in Nisan, if there's hail in Nisan, it means so-and-so, if there's in Iyar, etc., etc. And again, for many of these texts, I have small fragments in Aramaic, and then I'm trying to look for, outside the Geniza, for Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic versions of these texts that help me reconstruct the Aramaic text. There's a book of seismology. So if there's an earthquake in the month so-and-so, it will mean that so-and-so will happen. And there's a manual of palmomancy, of twitch divination. If your eye twitched, it means that so-and-so will happen to you. If your other eye twitched, it means that so-and-so will happen to you. If your forehead twitched, it means that so-and-so will happen to you. If your nose twitched, etc., etc. Acapite ad calcem, so from head to foot. All these texts are always arranged from head to foot. And again, this is a genre that we know very well from outside the Jewish world. Now we have it also in Aramaic. There are two dream interpretation manuals. You all know this kind of literature on aromancy, one of which is relatively well preserved and is very interesting because it's related to a similar text that we find in the Babylonian Talmud. I won't go into this, but this will also be very interesting for Talmudists because it looks like an earlier version of the text that we also find in the Talmud. And there's a second dream interpretation text, which is very fragmentarily preserved, but clearly not the same as the first one. So again, we see how Jews had more than one version of each type of these manuals. There's one manual of Goralot, of sortes, that is, you probably throw 2 dice, numbered from 1 to 5, and then if the answer is, let's say, 2 and 3, you go to the answer 2, 3, and it will tell you, you man, you are worried by the things that happen all around you, but really don't worry, and everything will be okay in the end, and you will see some adversity, but then things will sort themselves out, this kind of thing. Again, it's a text that it's a kind of text, it's a genre that we have in many languages, and now we also have it in Aramaic. So this is my corpus, and these are the texts I'm working on to publish them. What I want to very briefly show you is what manuscripts they travel in the Genize. So sometimes this is the planetary horologion. So you see on Sunday, in the hour of the sun, whoever goes out on a mission, on business, will return happy, etc., etc. So, and this manuscript, the manuscript itself, this page actually is a glossary, a Talmudic glossary offering explanation in Judeo-Arabic of difficult words in the Mishnah. And it's very clear that this is a very long text, and that my text, is a short text that was written on the blank page at the end of the manuscript. So here you have a text that was just copied, as a single unit at the end of a manuscript that dealt with something else. Here you have a different situation. And you see how badly preserved some of my fragments are. What you have on the right is a very fragmentary preservation of Masoret Ezra, this text that tells you what will happen if the 1st of January falls on Sunday, and you see here Betraya, on Monday, the winter will be good. So if January 1st falls on Monday, the winter will be good, so and so. And the reason why I know this text, that this is the text, is because I have many copies of it outside the Genize. And what you have here is all the rest, and also on the other side of this volume, it's all calendrical calculations. You see here, you also say, Harotze ladat be'eze yom yavo kalenda shelem. If you want to know mathematically when the calendar Januaris falls, then you calculate this and this and this and this. So what you have here is a manual or a manuscript that deals with calendar, including this calendologion. So this is not, the whole text is not astrological, the whole manuscript, it's calendrical, but you also get this calendologion, which tells you what the year will look like if the 1st of January, if the calendar Januaris falls on each day of the week. Here we're moving to a different situation. Here, this is a manuscript where you have several of these divinatory texts together. It starts with the wheat price. This text is the wheat price prognostication text from the Tkufat Tevet, from the winter solstice. So it gives the text in Aramaic. Then it says in Judeo-Arabic, Tafsir Dhalika, the interpretation of this or the translation of this. And then it offers a translation in Judeo-Arabic, in Arabic written in Hebrew letters, of this text. So you get the text once in Aramaic and once in an Arabic translation, which makes much more sense for people in medieval Cairo, because this is the language they know much better. Then you get some more astrological material, and then all this is a part of the treatise of Shem. So you get another long astrological text. If I had more pages, I have 8 pages of this manuscript, but there were more. And if I had more, I would probably have more astrological texts. So this is a manuscript in which someone copied several divinatory texts, one after the other. This is an even clearer example. Here you have a manual of divination from the lunar eclipses, a manual of divination from solar eclipses, another manual of divination from solar eclipses, the dream interpretation manual. So here you have a manuscript that someone clearly collected a lot of these texts as a kind of a corpus, presumably because he wanted to use them. He was perhaps a professional diviner, and he had a manuscript which he copied with many different Aramaic manuals of divination. I'm showing here, I won't show you the images, but I'm just showing you another example. This is a manuscript that's relatively well preserved in the Genize in Oxford. And what you have here is you have the Goralot text, the book of sortes in Aramaic, in Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. Then you have a Hebrew translation of the Aramaic dream interpretation that you find in other fragments. Then you have another Hebrew text about dreams. I won't go into it. Then you have short blessings to recite when you see Jerusalem. And I won't go into why these things are connected. Then you have several magical recipes in Hebrew and in Aramaic, more magical recipes, and then you have Aramaic proverbs. So here, Proverbs, I don't mean the biblical book of Proverbs. I mean, you know, like educational proverbs for teaching purposes, like what you find in Alphabeta de Ben Sira, for those of you who know this text. So here you can see a manuscript that's a miscellany of many different texts, but you see that this guy was interested in divination and in magic. He had several manuals of divination, he had several magical texts, and he also had other types of texts in his miscellany booklet. And of course, I don't have the whole booklet, so he may have had other texts as well copied there. Let me talk a little bit about parallels. Tell me, I'm stopping this for a second to see how much time I have. 11:34. Okay, so I think I don't have much time, right? So I will just say I won't go into the whole issue of different types of parallels. I'll just show you one example. Or first of all, I'll show you what types I have. I showed you before the wheat price text in Aramaic, immediately followed by the Judeo-Arabic translation. So this is one case where you have parallels, but they're basically translations. I have, for example, for the Goralot text, the book of Sortes, I have it almost entirely preserved in Aramaic. And then I have very fragmentary Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic translations of it, all in the Cairo Genizah. So in the Genize itself, at around the same time, 11th, 12th century, you see the text in circulation in three different languages, in the original Aramaic, in Hebrew translation, and in a translation into Arabic, written in Hebrew letters. As I said before, the Masoret Ezra, which is called in Latin Revelatio Estrae, and the Treatise of Shem are very well known in many different languages, so I can compare my Aramaic text with the text in Greek, Latin, and other languages. I have, as I said before, you know, one of my dream manuals is paralleled in the Babylonian Talmud, and I have several examples of texts that are paralleled also in Syriac, and I will show you one example, and that's a solar eclipse per month text with the Syriac parallel. And here I'm very briefly showing you. And what I want to say is that many times you get texts that sound similar because the genres are similar. So you have a text that explains to you that, you know, if there's a, let's say, a solar eclipse in the month of Av, then there will be a war here and a plague there, and these people will die, and these pregnant women will have babies, and people will have eye diseases and all kinds of things like that. So when you read these manuals in many different languages, they sound very similar. They all sound basically the same. But when you look for specific parallels, often you see it's not the same because, you know, it has the same kind of predictions, but not the same predictions. But look at this example. The text on the right is in Syriac. And what it says is that if there's a solar eclipse in the month of Av, the Indians and the Ethiopians will be killed. Pregnant women will miscarry, will have premature abortions. The enemies of the king will be killed. And the Chaldeans of Babylonia will fall by the sword and will die. Now look at my Aramaic text, which is not very well preserved, but still it has an if, that is, and if there's a solar eclipse in the month of Av, the Indians will move, and they have these expressions, people will move from one, like be exiled, will move from one place to another. So the Indians will move, and something will fall in all the residents of Babylonia. So first of all, look, in two different texts in different languages and from different periods, because the Syriac manuscript is much, much later than my manuscript. But still, in two of them, if there's a solar eclipse in the month of Av, the Indians will do something. This is a very rare prediction. This cannot be an accident. This is clearly a parallel. And look, it's both of them speaks about Babylonia, but here it says Chaldaya de Babel, the Chaldeans, the Chaldean astrologers of Babel. And here it says Kol Dayarei Babel. I have a feeling that my text here is corrupt, that this should have been Bechaldaei Babel. You see, in one word, Bet Kaf Lamed Daled Aleph Yud, so instead of Yud Resh, so, and a sword will fall upon all the Chaldeans, or upon the Chaldeans of Babylonia, just as in the Syriac text. So sometimes these parallels in other languages can even help me reconstruct or better understand the Aramaic text that I have in the Genize. What does all this tell us? And here I will finish. First of all, it tells us that the Jews of late antiquity shared the interest in manuals of divination that was shared by everyone else around them. The Aramaic texts joined the texts in these genres, which were written in Greek, in Syriac, in Mandaic. Of course, a lot of them are much older. They go back to Babylonian, to Akkadian literature. They are tested also in Egypt, in Demotic, in Hieratic, in various writing systems of Egypt. And again, later on, they are tested all over the place in all the languages of the world. I'm sure that in Russian too. I don't know Russian. I cannot say anything about this literature in Russian, but I'm sure that it exists because it exists in every other language in the world. I know, for example, in China, in Tibet, they also have these kinds of texts. What these Aramaic texts also show us are very important and very interesting processes of translation and adaptation between culture. And just one example, when you have an Aramaic text that is based on the calendar Januaris, that is on the Roman calendar. This is not the Jewish calendar. This makes no sense at all in the Jewish world, but still someone wanted to translate that text into Aramaic. And what probably happened, the text probably began its life in Latin, because this is, the Greeks also don't have calendae. If you know Latin, you know the expression ad calendas graecas, which means never, because the Greeks don't have calendae. So this is a text that probably began its life in Latin, was translated into Greek, and from Greek was translated by Jews into Aramaic because they found this useful. And there are more examples like that. A third point that is very interesting and very important to me is that all this literature was transmitted outside rabbinic literature. It's not a part of the Mishnah and Talmud and Tosefta, etc. And some of them are non-rabbinic, even in the sense that the rabbis would not have liked this kind of literature. It's very deterministic. It's very hard to sort of make it congru with monotheism and with divine providence, because if there's a solar eclipse and all the people whose names begin with Aleph will die, then where does God fit into that system? So these are problematic texts, and yet many Jews apparently found them very interesting and very useful. And for me, this sheds more light on non-rabbinic culture in late antiquity. This is something that I find very important. And these texts are also important for their Aramaic, because their Aramaic sometimes is very nice Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. I won't go into this, but if you look at Sokolov's new dictionaries, you'll see that he makes use of some of my texts. And the last point I want to make is that, as I said before, it's now more than 120, it's actually now 125 years since the Cairo Genizah was discovered, and yet no one ever published these texts. No one ever looked for these texts. And this tells you something about the priorities of Genizah scholars and the priorities of Jewish studies scholars in general, because for them, these texts are superstitious, they're not Jewish, they're not nice texts. And for me, it's very strange that, it took so long for scholars to come out and say, but these are very important texts for the study of Jewish culture in late antiquity. So this is basically what I'm doing. And I just want to show you that it's not an easy task. This is what one of my fragments look like. So you see Betevet, in the month of Tevet, if there's a lunar eclipse, something Mavta Yeheve Bechula, so there will be death in all, and Guva Yipok, so locusts will come out, and at the beginning or something of the year, the Shata, they will be afraid. And look here, you see that this is now the whole parchment got mixed up. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that you have to try to build together. So this is what I do, and this is what I wanted to show Nina and all of you for her birthday. So thank you very much.
Хочу поблагодарить прежде всего Гидеона за его великий труд. И я совершенно, к сожалению, не занимаюсь этой темой, но мне кажется, что если говорить очень обобщенно, это очень важно методологически. Посмотрите, 100 лет назад считалось, что иудаизм – это такая религия, в которой нет мифологии, и что в Библии нет ничего мифологического. Сейчас любой исследователь или просто читатель понимает, что мифология, конечно, присутствует в протобиблейской, в библейском тексте и постбиблейской в иудаизме. И я думаю, что то, что совершил Gideon Bohak, это революция в обращении к магии, показывает, что то, что называют культурой повседневности, повседневность присутствует в жизни благочестивого иудея, точно так же, как благочестивого китайца. И чем дальше мы будем этим заниматься, тем больше мы увидим эти универсальные закономерности. И еще раз большое спасибо Гидеону.
Спасибо большое за доклад. У меня такой вопрос. Вот тексты, с которыми вы работали, там где-то авторы дают ссылку на Писание, да, обосновывая свой такой, своеобразный интерес к мифологии, к магии и так далее. Или это настолько естественно, что даже ссылку на Писание не дается, чтобы обосновать свои такие вот интересы?
They don't justify by making references, but they do make references sometimes. And for example, sometimes they use Hebrew expressions because they're writing in Aramaic, so they use Hebrew or Aramaic expressions that are taken from the Bible. So they clearly know the Bible. The Bible is part of their cultural heritage, but they don't need it to justify what they're doing.
Они не пытаются оправдать свой интерес ссылками на Библию, но при этом Библия, безусловно, это часть их культурного наследия, и они пользуются цитатами на еврейском и арамейском языке, теми выражениями, которые встречаются в Библии.